I first want to thank the Vera Institute of Justice for organizing this event to commemorate the ADA and my fellow panelists and the organizations they represent for their tireless work supporting people with disabilities in the criminal justice system. My name's Kathryn Walker, and I'm the Criminal Justice Fellow for the ARC's National Center on Criminal Justice and Disability. With 660 chapters nationwide, the ARC is the largest national nonprofit organization in the United States providing advocacy and direct services across the lifespan for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, that's IDD. Over 65 years old, the ARC has chapters in 48 states and the District of Columbia, serving more than 1.5 million people. Our mission is to promote and protect the human rights of people with IDD and actively support their full inclusion and participation in the community. For those unfamiliar with intellectual and developmental disabilities, people with intellectual disabilities, that's ID, experience significant limitations in intellectual functioning and adaptive behavior as expressed in conceptual, social, and practical everyday living skills. People with developmental disabilities may not have an accompanying IQ deficit, but still experience substantial functional limitations. So that was a lot of vocabulary there. So common examples include people with autism spectrum disorder, Down syndrome, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and then intellectual disability, which we formerly referred to as mental retardation, but we no longer use that vocabulary. So today, we're here to celebrate the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the ADA signifies a powerful acknowledgement by our representative democracy that disability should never limit opportunity or community inclusion. It is codified recognition of the deep discrimination people with disabilities have faced and continue to face, and provides a legal recourse in the face of that discrimination. The ADA acknowledges in law a historically segregated and isolated minority and is one of the great civil rights statutes of our time. However, any law without enforcement is powerless to create sustainable change. Enforcement must expand across the criminal justice system to ensure the ADA's intent to desegregate isn't nullified using our criminal justice system as modern-day institution. So in response to broad concerns about criminal justice system efficacy, the ARC created the National Center on Criminal Justice and Disability, that's NCCJD. And the center provides training and technical assistance addressing both victim and witness and also suspect and offender issues with a focus on intellectual and developmental disability. Funded by the Bureau of Justice Assistance, NCCJD's goal is to build the capacity of the criminal justice system to respond to people with disabilities from first contact with law enforcement, through incarceration, and on through transition back to community living. NCCJD is in the process of developing the Pathways to Justice training curriculum, which uses disability response teams to equip communities to respond to people with disabilities enmeshed in the criminal justice system. Using the Pathways to Justice curriculum, disability response teams provide training for law enforcement, victim services providers, and attorneys. We're heavily self-advocate led during these trainings as well. NCCJD also responds to information and referral and technical assistance requests from around the country. Since NCCJD opened in September of 2013, we have responded to over 300 requests from around the nation and have observed a high prevalence of suspect offender cases, 24 of which have been related to sex crimes. Another concern is the high prevalence of what we call hidden disabilities, people who function on the higher end of the spectrum of their disability, making identification really difficult for criminal justice professionals. This specifically creates problems when, for example, a police officer responds to a call involving a person with autism who is judged to be dangerous rather than displaying typical behaviors related to their disability. People with IDD, both juveniles and adults, are cycling through the criminal justice system with little or no acknowledgement of their disability. In 1994, the Department of Justice provided funding to the ARC to create materials for law enforcement officers about accommodating people with disabilities. The project supported voluntary compliance with Title II of the ADA and focused on explaining different accommodations both law enforcement and legal communities could use to ensure the rights of people with disabilities were protected. That project planted a vision for the ARC's current NCCJD, and without passage of the ADA, our current work would be impossible. The Bureau of Justice Assistance support of the creation of NCCJD and the willingness of those gathered today to engage this issue proves that the ADA remains alive and well. We're taking steps forward. However, ensuring that no one with a disability is excluded from participation or denied the benefits of services, programs, or activities of a public entity is no easy task, particularly when it comes to our criminal justice system. Consider the various challenges faced by people with IDD in the criminal justice system. As suspects and offenders, people may not want their disability to be noticed. This is known as the cloak of competence, and therefore pretend to understand their rights and say what others want to hear. We've seen multiple people waiving their Miranda rights. Often have few or if any options for alternative sentencing and or treatment, as sentence reduction credits are often contingent on good behavior, work, or program participation, all things that are inaccessible to people with IDD. They may be placed in institutions to regain competency to stand trial when they were never competent to begin with. They may take plea bargains, not understanding the consequences, or because counsel is convinced they will make poor witnesses in their own cases. While research is lacking, we know that this population is heavily overrepresented in the criminal justice system, and the numbers vary. You've heard them across the board here, and we have an estimated 70% of justice-involved youth have disabilities, and you said as high as 80% when you were speaking, including psychiatric disabilities as well as IDDs. Funding for research in this area is sorely lacking, and NCCJD continues to advocate for funding to focus on critical issues such as screening for disability in jails. We can't know how many people are there if we're not screening for disability as they come through the door. As victims and witnesses, people with IDD are easily victimized and targeted for victimization, less likely to be able to report, easily influenced by and eager to please others, more likely to wrongly believe the perpetrator is their friend, or not considered as credible witnesses and denied the right to testify, and this can be as a victim or a witness to a crime. Thanks to legislation that added a question about presence of disability to the existing National Crime Victim Survey, we now know that people with disabilities are 3 times as likely to be victims of violent crimes when compared to those without disabilities. You mentioned this earlier. Violent crimes including rape, sexual assault, robbery, and aggravated and simple assault. When looking at the rate of victimization among people with different types of disabilities, people with cognitive disabilities, which is one of the many vocabulary words to describe this IDD population, face the highest risk of victimization. Focusing priorities for criminal justice reform for people with disabilities begins with education. We regularly encounter criminal justice professionals who do not know the difference between mental illness, which is a mood, thought, and feeling disorder, often treatable with medication, and intellectual and developmental disability. The practical differences for criminal justice professionals are profound. For example, someone with mental illness may respond positively to medication and regain competency to stand trial. Someone with an IQ of 50, who was never competent to begin with and will never regain competency to stand trial regardless of educational efforts, may still be held in jail for an extended period of time undergoing competency restoration treatments. As a note, this issue is nuanced, and there is a small population of people with IDD that will regain competency. We, however, are pushing for speedier evaluation so that these cases can be identified much quicker and people can wait. Right now, people are waiting sometimes years, and this is without ever being formally charged because they're not competent to stand trial. Another issue is providing law enforcement with accurate training. We are thankful for current law enforcement training on mental illness provided through crisis intervention training, that's CIT training. However, IDD, Alzheimer's, and autism typically share only 2 to 3 hours in a 40-hour week. We must ensure that any law enforcement training includes both disabilities, includes all types of disabilities so that officers are fully prepared to respond in situations, whether the person has mental illness, an intellectual or developmental disability, a physical disability, no matter what kind of disability they have. So stories are a powerful way to see the ADA in action and equally to see tragedies that occur without ADA accommodations. So I have 2 stories from our information referral process from around the country. The first is Mr. Reginald Neely Latson. He's a young man with autism and intellectual disability who was incarcerated in a solitary confinement cell for over a year and was only released after a guilty plea and subsequent pardon from the governor of Virginia. So Neely's underlying charges stemmed from a phone complaint to police that a young black man in a hoodie was loitering in front of the public library, and then a subsequent mental health crisis once he was incarcerated. Neely was waiting for the library to open, and when approached by police, he refused to provide his name and was restrained by a police officer. He attempted to leave the situation, a very fight or flight response, which is common for people with autism. And the altercation that followed seriously injured the officer and sent Neely to jail. While in jail, Neely struck a corrections officer while he was being transferred to a suicide watch cell. So while being transferred from a solitary confinement where he was held for his own safety, that was their explanation, to a suicide watch cell, he struck a corrections officer and was charged with felony battery on a law enforcement for both of those altercations. Not once was his disability taken into account, and this eliminated any opportunity to provide accommodations. I will also mention that, again, he had to take a guilty plea and then receive a pardon from the governor, which as an information and referral center is really disheartening because that's the answer I have right now when people call is, we'll just go get a pardon from the governor. So we need a little work. A second case example, James Metters is a self-advocate with intellectual disabilities. He's been working with the ARC for years, and he's experienced multiple sexual assaults over the course of his lifetime. Each instance left him with the conviction that he would never be believed. It was not until he experienced a traumatic rape in his own apartment that he came forward and successfully prosecuted the rapist. However, it took a full team of the local chapter of the ARC and a staff person and a local rape crisis center to help the attorneys understand his disability and succeed with prosecution. So going forward, the events in Ferguson, Missouri surrounding the shooting of an 18-year-old black man in August of 2014 received national attention and resulted in angry protests by the community, sparking a national debate about police use of force. We had the case of Sheehan versus the city of San Francisco, where police officers forcibly entered the room of Teresa, knowing she had a mental illness, and shot her 5 times with no attempt to accommodate by using de-escalation techniques that are commonly used for people with mental illness. The officers then requested immunity from a lawsuit claiming there was no established law requiring them to accommodate her mental illness. Inside the courtroom, Justice Sotomayor seemed to be the one voice of reason when she said, "Isn't the ADA intended to ensure that police officers try mitigation in these situations before they jump to violence?" NCCJD enthusiastically agrees. And so while we celebrate this monumental day and contemplate all the good that's come from the ADA, remember those who continue to suffer segregation, discrimination, and misunderstanding because of their disability. Moving forward, we've got to look to people with disabilities as self-advocates to lead the charge in criminal justice system reform. We've got to work to give people with disabilities, whether victims, witnesses, suspects, or offenders, a voice. As professionals, we must actively include people with disabilities in any meaningful criminal justice reform or training initiatives, ensuring that their lived experiences are fully accounted for in future efforts. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today, and I have a quote actually from my supervisor, Leanne Davis, who wanted to be here and couldn't make it, and she says, "I have the ADA to thank for bringing me to the ARC and introducing me to what has become a lifelong commitment to advocating with and for people with disabilities. About 20 years ago, I was hired to direct an ADA project that created materials for criminal justice professionals and accommodations for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities so that they could get fair treatment in the system. This seed money from the Department of Justice eventually led to the creation of our national center in 2013. It's frightening to think how the lives of people with disabilities would be different today without the passage of the ADA, and it's equally exciting to dream about what the next 25 years may hold." So, thank you.